Welcome back for the second of our lectures on opioids. We're going to talk about a couple of different time periods in U.S. history and how they relate to opioid regulation and abuse. And we'll start with opioid abuse before the Harrison Act, so before that major piece of national level legislation in 1914. So before the Harrison Act, we saw three different kinds of opioid use and dependence, basically. We had those patent medicines. Remember, these are the ones that you can make in your backyard, no real regulation about them. They can contain just about anything you want, and you can sell them describing any kind of benefit that you like. The reality is that a lot of these include opium. We also saw smoking of opium. This was primarily by Chinese laborers. How this might look is kind of depicted in that picture on the right-hand corner of the slide there. And then injection of morphine, so the more refined form that was injected directly into the body. So those were the three main categories, with injectable morphine being the most dangerous form of use. And if we look at how much the population was dependent, so this isn't use, this is dependence, the peak of this was really at the beginning of the 20th century, and it could have been as high as 1% of the population. So fairly widespread, definitely the highest rates of opioid use that we've reported. So at this time, opioid dependence wasn't really seen as a major social problem. The smoking of opioids was a bit frowned upon, but that was mostly because of the ethnic groups that it was associated with, those immigrant laborers. The opium consumption in patent medicines, very acceptable socially. And the fact that it might lead to dependence was just kind of an inevitable effect. People were seen with a lot of sympathy if they ended up there, possibly because of the typical person that this happened to. So our typical user at this time was a 30 to 50-year-old middle-class white woman who actually purchased the drugs legally through patent medications. So we didn't really see this. Again, think of this maybe as the alcohol of the time, the perceptions of alcohol. There are people who are clearly dependent on alcohol, and it can cause problems, but it doesn't mean for most of us that we would consider banning the sale of alcohol or the use of alcohol in other populations. So this perception that just because some people had a problem with it didn't mean that everyone had to be banned from using it. So then in 1914, we see the Harrison Act passed. And remember, this is where the federal government really is asserting its right to tax sales of these sorts of substances. So when the Harrison Act became to be enforced, it made it more difficult to obtain opioids, and really the only sources of drugs that were common were illegal dealers. So the result of the Harrison Act was that opioid use patterns changed. Oral use, so through those patent medications, declined, and that the primary maybe moved to alcohol actually, and that what was left was a group of users who either injected morphine or heroin. This increased both the cost and the risk of use, a lot more danger in consuming these methods. They were more potent and more toxic. And as both the cost and the risk of use increased, we saw people tend to favor the most potent method, so the most bang for the buck. And again, we saw this change that people who were dependent on opioids were now criminals rather than victims. So we saw another change after World War II, where we saw the use of heroin increase in low-income areas of large cities. And then in the 60s and 70s, another continuing increase, still not as high as the beginning of the 20th century, but again, this use was associated with minority populations. In New York at the time, we get the Rockefeller drug laws, which were the strictest drug laws in the United States. But we also saw a trend in heroin use, again associated with military service. This was with soldiers who were deployed in Vietnam. So heroin in Vietnam was relatively cheap, it was relatively pure, and it was relatively easy to get. A random sample of military personnel in Vietnam, about 5% of them tested positive for opioids. And it was not injected so much as smoked or sniffed, because that was what was common in the setting. But we did see that most users stopped when they returned to the United States. This could have been because of difficulty obtaining it, or changes in social pressure. But either way, most of the personnel who used heroin in Vietnam, when they returned home, they stopped that usage. So what we learned from that is that if the conditions are correct, so under certain specific conditions, a relatively high percentage of people will use opioids recreationally. Remember, our highest reported rate before this point was about 1% in our population. And then also some really interesting observations about opioid dependence. People were able to start in a certain setting and then stop when they returned to their more typical setting. So some interesting patterns there related with use in use of heroin in Vietnam related to the Vietnam War. So moving on to production of heroin. Most of the heroin that's used in the United States is derived from poppies that are actually grown either in Mexico or Colombia. And we've seen some manufacturing changes over the past couple of decades. In the 70s, the purity of the heroin available in the United States was about 5%, moving up through the 80s to the current time, about 40 to 60% purity. So a really pretty dramatic increase in the purity, but we still have a very small fraction of Americans who use heroin. This is not a really common drug of use or abuse in the United States. About 0.2% report past year use of any kind of heroin here in the U.S. Of course, when we talk about opioid abuse in the U.S. In the modern era, most of what we're talking about is the abuse of prescription opioids. This includes Vicodin, Percocet, Oxy, lots of different trade names, but two major groups, hydrocodone and oxycodone. And here we actually see about 12 million Americans who reported using prescription opioids in the past year. A couple of major routes of administration: oral, actually taking the pills, insufflation, or injection. So several different ways that those opioids are abused. We do see some definite safety concerns. We see from that Dawn data that prescription opioids are our third most common reason for ER visits and the most common source of deaths. And most of those overdoses actually are of use of opioids in combination, typically with alcohol. So some real risks for the people who consume opioids that way. If we look at how the different opioid chemicals are constituted, you can see some real similarities there in the chemical structure, both morphine, codeine, and heroin. Remember, they're all derived from opium, which is what we give them their common chemical characteristics. So when we talk about prescription opioids, basically we're talking about prescription pain relievers or analgesics that are narcotics. We've got the natural products, morphine and codeine, that are derived directly from the poppy plant. And then we've got the heroin, which is based on the poppy plant but chemically altered. And then we've got the ones that are completely synthetic, the ones that are lab created. And this is where we find oxycodone, hydrocodone, fentanyl, drugs like that. So classified here by their source, whether it's natural, semi-synthetic, or synthetic created in a lab. So this will wrap up our second lecture on opioids, and we'll be back to talk about the mechanism of action.